Chapter 6. A virtuous woman is a crown to her husband, but she that maketh ashamed is as rottenness in his bones. Proverbs 12:4. Hava stood before the polished metal plate which bore her image, arranging her hair and fussing with her garment for the 10th time. Just around the corner, her handmaid was fiddling with something. "Dura, I do wish you would hurry," Hava said, glancing nervously at the door. "It may be fashionable to be late in some places, but Solomon does not value it. He insists on punctuality when meeting with foreign guests. If I do not appear at the door when he calls, he is cross with me." "I am sorry, Your Highness. I did not realize I would be doing your hair 3 times tonight," Dura replied. On the bench before Hava was strewn an array of barrettes, combs and brushes, beauty potions, perfumes, ribbons, pins, floral decorations, accents, and numerous other unidentifiable objects meant to enhance beauty. Hava had built up a sizable collection, trying to satisfy her desire for something new while staying within the limits of what would be acceptable to Solomon. She found those limits confining at times, and was occasionally frustrated at his lack of sense concerning the special needs of a queen. The foreign wives who attended these kinds of feasts often outshone her in their apparel and personal decor, a fact which she found unbecoming to the great kingdom Solomon was trying to create. Israelite women had extra challenges. Hava knew that the restrictions of her religion, as strictly interpreted by some, made it difficult to make a good showing among the noble ladies of other nations. Since highlighting the face with colors was considered strictly heathen, Israelite women had to rely on the more basic arts of wardrobe, jewelry, and hairstyling to keep pace. Hava found this to be a decided disadvantage. Dura's voice sounded from the adjacent room. "You could wear the tiara. It would be easier to finish your hair if I did not have to do all of it." Hava looked over at the tiara. That had been another of her apparent mistakes. She had purchased it in hope from a Babylonian merchant, but then was disappointed to learn that Solomon was not pleased with it. He'd claimed, of all things, that the outfit was that of a Babylonian temple prostitute. Still, to her, the tiara was a splendid piece. She could understand not wearing the garment with which it belonged, but the tiara seemed most harmless by itself. "It may come to that if you do not hurry," Hava replied. Hava was looking over her gown. The tiara would, in fact, match her colors and give a little spice to what she thought was an otherwise drab base hue. She reached over and placed it on her head, turning before the reflection to get a view from different angles. She remembered why she had liked it. It added that one final touch that lifted an ordinary outfit into the extraordinary. She sighed, pursing her lips. Solomon had not actually objected to the tiara in particular. He had reacted to the entire outfit. Without the whole of it, would he even recognize the tiara as having been part of it? There was a knock on the door. "Hava?" It was Solomon. I'm almost ready," she called, quickly lowering the tiara. "No hurry, my love. I'm soon going to the portico to escort the guests and myself. You may come down when you are ready." She breathed a sigh of relief. "Thank you. I'll be down soon." Hava turned back to her mirror and with lips pursed glanced up and down at her reflection. "Dura, do you remember that white silk gown with the gold accents?" Silence. Dura's hands temporarily stopped whatever they were fiddling with. "Oh, do not be angry with me, Dura. I just want to try it on, just for fun. We have a little extra time now." "It's in the wardrobe behind you." Hava stood up and sliced her hands through the hanging garments. There were so many. "Where?" "It's on the left, about halfway down." Hava located the gown in question and pulled it out, looking it over while holding the tiara in her other hand. When the tiara passed over the gown, she caught her breath. Quite coincidentally, the headpiece's design and colors were striking against the white gown, complementing it even better than the one she was presently wearing. "Just get ready to do some small braids, Dura," she said. "I think this is going to work." Dura let out a sigh of relief. You're wearing the tiara?" "You have to see this," Hava exclaimed. "Come here a moment." Dura came around the corner to see Hava holding the tiara in front of the gown. Her eyes widened, and she put her hand over her mouth. "I never would have thought. The tiara looks fabulous with that. How did you think of it?" "It's a gift," Hava replied, thinking, "If only I were free to use it more." "I'll get the pins for the braids. The gold ones would be nice, don't you think?" Dura asked. "Gold and black," Hava said. "Right," she agreed, shaking her finger at Hava with an expression that communicated full approval. Working with Hava was sometimes difficult, but Dura had to agree that the queen-to-be did have a talent. It was part of her artistic nature. She was also skilled in drawing portraits, as a singer, and as a sculptor. Given free rein to do what she wanted, she could shine ever so brightly. Hava slipped on the garment, placed the tiara on her head, posing for the reflection. She was not an unbeautiful woman. She still had just a touch of the charming little child in her face, but the rest of her features had matured into elegance, and, when properly attired, she would pass for a respectable queen in any land. Her personality added much to her appearance. If new acquaintances found Hava plain on first sight, they simply had to see her smile once. Her eyes could absolutely dance. She could light up a room. Her locally famous laugh, not loud, but somehow sharp enough to be heard amid a crowd, cut tensions and changed the atmosphere around her. Her engaging personality outshone her appearance, and wherever she went, laughter was soon to follow, even if she did tend to push the limits of proper queenly decorum. Meanwhile, Solomon stood in his private chamber, facing the open window, stroking his beard, oblivious to the view before him. He had been carefully measuring the potential import of the feast he was about to host. In the royal court, every event, even a social one, had political undercurrents. Every act performed by the royal court was symbolic. Every passing statement made or not made, every expression sent or withheld, was presumed to carry layers of meaning as various as the individuals who tried to interpret them. Though the present feast had no open political billing, Solomon did very much want to finalize some hard-earned trust and goodwill among some of the attendees, but without compromising any of Israel's interest. It was a delicate balancing act. Solomon had been studying history and had learned that in many of the historic attacks on Israel, the attacking army had mobilized and entered through the valley of Esdraelon. He felt the need to install a permanent force there and at other points along the trading routes, but movements of that nature could be interpreted as preludes to aggression. Solomon also understood that Israel was positioned at a crossroads of major trading routes, both a blessing and a potential danger. The political landscape had changed fundamentally when Israel took control of both the eastern and the western trading routes. The eastern corridor had been secured by David when he vassalized the nations east of the Jordan. The western, through Philistia, had been secured by Solomon himself. Now, there remained no reasonable trading route from north to south outside of Israel. Solomon, realizing that this retipped all of the scales, now had to respond wisely to the benefits and challenges of the new arrangement. Israel stood to gain profits from trading if the traveling caravans continued to pass through as before. The problem was caravans carried foreigners and, with them, influences from heathen lands, influences that Israel could not tolerate. Beyond that, a rumor had spread throughout the world that Solomon was drafting foreign residents in Israel into his labor force for construction of the temple. Some foreign travelers consider this policy an insult to their countrymen, others even worse. Solomon could not compromise the values of Israel, but he did want the message of his kingdom to spread, for he was committed to keeping the charge his father had given him, to model the worship of Jehovah to the nations. A strict closing of the borders was as undesirable as it was impractical, but implementing policies that would cause otherwise friendly merchants to hesitate to enter Israel could have just as negative an impact. The truth was, foreign labor was being implemented for the construction of the temple, according to a strategy that his father had conceived. It could not be constructed otherwise, without a crippling increase in taxes, something Solomon was unwilling to do. One of the most important purposes of the convention Solomon had been hosting for the past week was to open a dialogue with the major mercantile players in the world to ease their unspoken tensions concerning Israel's policies. The feast of the present evening was the final event in a week of careful strategic diplomacy. Wives and consorts were welcome for the final ceremony. In most Eastern cultures, women dined separately from men, but in respect for the customs of some of his visitors, Solomon had made an exception. The presence of women at feasts such as this was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it underscored the social nature of the event, maintaining a helpful, informal atmosphere. On the other hand, their words and actions could, and often would, be taken as representative of the kingdom even when they meant no such thing. Hava, in particular, was a challenge for Solomon. He very much needed her at this feast to represent the virtues of an Israelite wife, but he was praying and hoping that she would not do anything out of order, as she was wont to do. Egyptian traders would be present, so Solomon had seen to it that Kemizi, the daughter of Pharaoh Siamon, who had been given to Solomon as wife, had been brought from her home outside the city to attend the feast. Also, Naamah, the Ammonitess, was present. Both of these women were known at this time to be harboring tensions toward their husband king, since his policy of drafting foreigners into his labor force had become known. No doubt, complaints from their countrymen had reached their ears. Nonetheless, the absence of the foreign wives as international symbols of goodwill would be certainly noticed at a feast such as this. Bringing all of the wives to the banquet was impractical. Indeed, many of them Solomon had never even met. He concluded that he could achieve his goal by bringing a small sampling. These wives, at least, were known quantities. Bathsheba was present, of course, and Solomon hoped the experienced royal mother would help keep the younger queen safely in check. The silent presence of his assistants waiting in the open doorway behind him eventually penetrated Solomon's reverie. It was time to go. He passed the assistant, entered the hall, and immediately detected the rich smells drifting down from the dining area. The royal banquet hall had been carefully and knowledgeably decorated. Solomon had researched the cultures of his guests and had chosen furnishings designed to make them comfortable without including directly anything related to pagan worship. He suspected that travelers might be hungering for the diets of their homelands, and so had selected dishes to satisfy those cravings. The result was a carefully crafted international smorgasbord of sights, smells, and taste. Music and entertainment were also planned. His bodyguards, Yakin and Boaz, had moved into position as soon as the king left his chambers. These two most trusted servants had conceded to downgrade their normal military attire to more casual apparel, with the assurance that the weapons would still be available to them. Now they dutifully followed the king briskly down the hall toward the portico, where he would meet his guests. Solomon's face revealed the confident concentration familiar to all his aides, his sharp, dark eyes focusing ahead as if penetrating the very doors at the far end of the hall down which he strode. His mind was already far ahead of his body. His confidence, born of conclusions reached in mature deliberation, radiated from him, creating an atmosphere that inspired others to follow. It was no use trying to hurry those deliberations, as all who worked in the court well knew. But once he settled on a course and committed to action, he was unstoppable. There was nothing to do but follow or be left behind. He was a king who inspired followers more than he commanded them, a true leader. Solomon had been notified that the first of the guests had passed the gates to the grounds and were proceeding toward the banquet hall. His intent was to meet each of his guests personally at the door and let servants usher them in. He himself would enter last, after all who were expected had arrived. Okay, notify the reception team I want the washers to be at their post, he said. I assume the escorts and ushers are ready?
They are waiting at the gate, my lord.
And the food and wine? The confectioners have assured us that all is ready. Good. Has Nathan arrived? The assistant hesitated. Not yet, my lord. To this, Solomon responded with eloquent silence. Nathan the prophet, though always welcome and often invited, was the one person in the kingdom who could not necessarily be counted on to appear at the king's summons. It would remain to be seen if he would be present at this feast. Suddenly, Solomon had to slow his pace as his mother Bathsheba appeared beside him. He could see a question in her eyes immediately. What is it, mother? He asked, uncomfortable to be slowing down. I have been told that Hava is to perform. I know how important the ceremony is to you, and I would not want to repeat the debacle we had at the spring festival. Solomon waved her off. I've already seen to that, mother. I've been in contact with the director of music. I have approved every hymn that is to be sung. We will neither offend our guests nor embarrass our testimony with these songs. But he stopped suddenly, remembering something, and taking her by the elbow to lean in close. I've not yet seen what she plans to wear, he said, searching his mother's eyes. I have. I was just in her chamber moments ago. I did not have to correct her. It will be well. Good, he replied. There are few greater motivations for non-cooperation than too much correction. Which is why I said nothing. She will not embarrass us this time. Only those who knew Solomon very well could have read a nearly imperceptible expression of relief on his disciplined countenance. You are a blessing, mother. Now I need to be going, he said with a smile. He released his mother's elbow, gave her a quick kiss, and continued his march down the marble-paved hallway with his human train in tow. Bathsheba looked after him with pride. As Solomon and his entourage passed the large arched opening to the grand hall, he glanced in and suddenly stopped in a lurch, causing the guards following him to nearly run into him. Inside the room, decorators were adding finishing touches, lighting lamps and candles. Several were on high ladders, working on the final placement of a large blue banner on which was a gold embroidery of the lion emblem of Judah. It hung over the platform when the musical performance would take place. Deftly, Solomon cut into the room. Too low, he called out, loud enough to get the attention of everyone in the room. The banner blocks the light from the wall lamps, casting a shadow over the dining area. He broke off, his eyes suddenly caught by the struggle of a diminutive servant girl overburdened with a large platter of candles. He took 2 large strides forward and balanced the platter with one hand, supporting part of its weight in the other. You there, Micaiah? He called to a young man. Come help this maiden. The man stepped forward quickly. Turning back to the banner, Solomon commanded, Get it just above the window arches. Then pausing to look around the hall, he raised a finger and called out a single word, Atmosphere, and turned to stride out of the room. Everyone within hearing range knew well the import the king placed behind that single word. For even without its mention, atmosphere seemed to follow this gifted king as if it were woven into his royal train. Solomon had discerned in a glance the presence in the grand hall of all of his most important advisors. He had been briefed on the goals of the meeting and coached on how to approach and earn the trust of the merchants. He also noted the presence of ambassadors from the 4 vassal states that surrounded Israel: Ammon, Moab, Edom, and Midian. Solomon hoped and expected these would represent him well at this feast, where their tribes would benefit as much as Israel from increased trading. It was to these that he had first proposed the current effort, and upon his explaining the many benefits to them, they had enthusiastically cooperated, so far. But they were not without their doubts. Being paraded before the world was not always comfortable for a vassal, for though being in line with Israel promised them a share in its prosperity, it also put their material means on display before a covetous world. Solomon responded by promising them protection from any kingdom that became uncomfortably ambitious. Solomon and his entourage were now approaching the arched stone entry door. Beyond it spread the wide steps toward the outer gate. There the guests would enter after servants had tended to their animals and helped with their parcels. King Solomon and his aides proceeded down the steps. Long stone walkway lined with blossoming flowers and water pools behind stone benches stretched between the palace and the gate. Near the gate, a line of servants, dressed in fine matching apparel, was waiting with basins and water for the washing of feet. Behind them was another row with towels and anointing oils. Flowers were waiting for the noble ladies and garlands for the men. At the gate, Solomon began meeting his guests, greeting them in their own language, exchanging gifts with them, welcoming them to his personal home, and engaging them in small talk about the goings-on in their respective countries. As usual, the foreign guests were impressed with the new Israelite king's wide range of general knowledge and understanding. But as he greeted each new party, he discerned that many were yet holding unspoken questions about his rigid and sometimes seemingly bigoted religious practices. Escorts conducted each guest party to the grand hall. Prior to Solomon's arrival in the grand hall, Bathsheba, with a mother's insight, keen to the mind of her son, was busy examining every detail from the decor to the food to the dress of Solomon's wives. Suddenly, from across the room, she noted the change in Hava's attire. Her eyes went wide with surprise. That maiden! Bathsheba quickly excused herself from the group with which she was conversing and began making her way with some difficulty toward the queen-to-be, an endeavor made more challenging by the fact that her target kept moving, and by interruptions on several occasions by guests or servants offering comments or making requests. Finally, she was able to catch the eye of Benaiah, a trusted court adviser and warrior with a keen eye and strong spiritual sense, who had noticed her furtive movement in his direction. Bathsheba signaled to him with a pointed glance toward Hava. She saw him look over, quickly leave his group, and move toward the queen-to-be. Bathsheba continued to snake her way through the crowd, even as she saw Benaiah take Hava by the elbow and speak in her ear. "Here goes. Please let it go without incident." To Bathsheba's dismay, Hava did not immediately move apart from the group with which she was cavorting, forcing Benaiah to speak to her less privately than he had surely intended. Bathsheba renewed her efforts to hasten to the scene and finally arrived to Benaiah's obvious relief. "Queen Hava, I fear the servants have dishonored you," Bathsheba called loudly in the group. "You have common flowers when a queen's garland was prepared for you," she improvised, taking her by the elbow. "Come this way at once." Bathsheba continued directing Hava forcefully, smiling at the group all the while. She knew that Hava, once socially engaged, could only be pried away with difficulty, and only a strong intervention would have any chance of succeeding. Fortunately, she was able with her surprise approach to create a small space between Hava and the guest and capitalized on it to hustle Hava safely apart from them, even as the queen-to-be smiled and nodded over her shoulder at the man with whom she had last spoken. Once Bathsheba had Hava aside, she went about the task of hastily setting the servants to work on a queen's garland. "One that includes a headdress," she instructed a maidservant in a hushed but forceful voice. The maidservant blinked and then nodded, hastening toward a door. Bathsheba looked nervously toward the door where Solomon would soon appear, and once again caught the eye of Benaiah, who wiped mock perspiration from his forehead in response. When Solomon finally arrived in the hall, he was happy to find the atmosphere of the preliminaries pleasantly social. the members of his administration rightly at work mixing with the merchants.
But his keen eye quickly recorded the unsurprising absence of Nathan the prophet, as well as the curious absence of Hava and Bathsheba.
He took some time to mix among the conversing groups, sampling wine and encouraging guests to try grapes and other fruits from trays borne by tireless servants combing through the room. After some minutes, he noted the return of his mother and queen through a far doorway.
When the pace of the evening seemed to suggest it, the guests were invited to be seated, with Hava, Naamah, and Kamizi positioned where they could converse with the foreign women.
As the food was brought forth, Solomon himself called out the name of each dish to the welcoming cheers and applause of the guests from the region of the world from which the dish originated.
He was carefully monitoring the pace of events.
Later in the evening, some of the guests would be given the opportunity to speak, after which there would be music. He glanced over at his wives, attempting to read their faces. Naamah was generally pleasant, engaging as usual in intelligent conversation, attracting, as she often did, the curious glances of nearby men who seemed surprised to hear such wit proceeding from the lips of a woman, not to mention a beautiful queen. But Solomon, in his quick glances in her direction from down the table, was not unaware of the sarcasm in her expressions, and wondered if it was as apparent to others as to him. Hava and Kamizi, neither as intelligent nor as aware as Naamah, were oblivious to any such undertones and generally missed the underlying meanings in Naamah's comments. These two floated along the surface of most conversations, with the exception of Hava's infatuation with the female fashions of foreign lands, a subject the depths of which she could continually explore without boredom. Solomon noticed her engaged in a lively conversation with two wives of a Neo-Hittite trader, her cheerful cackling occasionally drifting like a chirping bird over the general noise of the conversation. Now and again, men glanced over to find the source of the cheerful sound. Solomon had noticed the unusual and unfamiliar garland that looped over Hava's head and suspected it had something to do with the earlier absence of Hava and Bathsheba. He made a note to investigate it at the next opportunity. In the meantime, the young king continued to impress, conversing freely with traders from every nation on issues both small and large. He had provided good wine, but soon noticed an overly frequent refilling of chalices among some of the merchants, and began to calculate a change in the order of events to prevent the feast from descending into delirium. A trader named Timhunkut, a very heavy-set, say it fat, and very prosperous multinational merchant of mixed origin, was becoming louder and more vocal in his comments as the wine loosened his tongue. "In the days of King Saul and David," Solomon overheard him say, "we needed only to rely upon the tribes along the eastern route to protect us. In those days, we all remember, the protection was as much from Israel itself as it was from the raiders. But today, if Israel provides protection from the raiders, who then protects us from Israel?" His comments were loud enough to be heard by some nearby, who temporarily dropped their conversations into lower tones. "Let us deal with Israel," the ambassador from Ammon replied calmly. "Your protection is still secure with us, as ours is with Israel. Israel is not pursuing aggression, but peace." Naamah, the Ammonitess, eyed the ambassador skeptically as he talked, while he avoided her glance, knowing she was thinking of the many Ammonites in Israel who had already been drafted into labor. "I'm certain that the Ammonite queen agrees with you," Timhunkut said sarcastically. "For who could not trust a king who would give his servants the untiring protection that can only be found under the eye of his whipmasters?" Naamah glanced at Timhunkut, then looked away in disgust. Others in the room were beginning to catch the tone of the exchange. "The current labor force is made up only of those foreigners who dwell within the tribal borders of Israel west of the Jordan," said the Moabite ambassador, who sat next to him. "They may leave Israel at any time and return to their own lands if they wish. There's no forced labor going on in any of our lands." Timhunkut finished off his chalice and held it up to a servant, who dutifully refilled it.
Israel is what it wants to be among vassals.
For if the Israelite army is under control of the king, who is to say the king will not need more temples in other cities for the worship of his God, which will require more laborers? Such will not come from Israel, I am sure. And who do you suppose will carry his stones then? He sloshed his chalice and threw back his head for another drink. Then the steady voice of Solomon broke in. My friend, the God of Israel is one. As such, he is not in need of more than one temple, any more than he needs more than one nation. Though Solomon had replied calmly, at the voice of the king, many heads turned from several seats down and across the table. Thusly it is written in our laws, he continued. Israel has no ambitions of expansion. But if we are enjoying peace and prosperity in this hour, it is only because of our God's blessing. All who wish to be so blessed may also be if they will honor his laws, he concluded with a smile. The voice of Solomon had caught the attention of all in the hall who had not previously noticed the exchange, with the exception of Hava, who was still chattering away at the Hittite queens. Suddenly, as if on cue, a door opened at the far end of the hall, and heads turned to see the empty space for a moment, followed by the appearance of a seemingly out-of-place old man, dressed in rough wilderness attire and holding a staff. The room went silent. Nathan had arrived. Keen eyes of Solomon quickly recognized the prophet. He always arrives at precisely the right moment. The king quickly began to calculate all the new possible tangents now that the prophet had been added to the mix at this delicate moment. Did not notice Hava slip up beside him to whisper in his ear at just the same instant. Dearest, he heard unexpectedly, could you look for a moment at the two Hittite wives sitting over there? They have some colors on that I do so admire, and they tell me these dyes are available in their countries, and we can have them here too if trading opens up. I just want to know if you would allow such things. I find them so attractive. Solomon turned his head slightly sideways, but kept his eyes on the far door, blinking in astonishment at being called upon to juggle such a delicate matter, while at the same time being asked by his queen to respond to such a trivial question. He glanced over at Hava, who was peering back at him with sincere eyes, apparently unaware of anything else taking place. I will speak to you about that in a moment, love, he whispered, then turned to face and greet Nathan the prophet. Hava frowned and then looked indignant before going back to her seat and fixing her eyes downward. She did not appear to notice Nathan's entrance. Distinguished guest, Solomon began, it is my great pleasure to introduce to you one of Israel's wisest and most beloved citizens, the prophet Nathan. He raised his hand in greeting to the prophet. Nathan raised his hand in return and began shuffling toward the table, his confused escort following along behind, not knowing quite what to do. The guest peered curiously at the strangely dressed man, who apparently had made no effort to choose attire appropriate to the occasion. Nathan, an advisor to 2 Israelite kings now, is a frequent observer of the proceedings in this kingdom, Solomon explained. His counsel is highly respected. Nathan nodded to a few of the guests as he passed, his wise old eyes twinkling as he came to take a seat next to the king. Timhunkut grunted irreverently. Counsel that would keep Jerusalem from becoming the international metropolis that the rhetoric of this gathering would suggest, he grumbled. The eyes of the room turned back toward the half-drunken trader. Nathan's twinkling expression changed not a whit at the comment as he took his seat, looking back and forth at the dishes in the table's center, as though he had not heard. Solomon chanced a quick glance at the prophet, then responded to Timhunkut. Israel has no qualm with any nation, my friend. we would be happy to entertain and assure safe passage to any trader who would come through our borders in peace. We only ask that our God be respected, as you would want us to respect yours, were we in your land. One, and only one God. That is the nub of the problem. For in any of our lands, your God would be welcome among all the rest of them, but in your land, it is He and He alone, Tim Huncut said coldly. Nathan was calmly dishing himself food, attempting to add nothing to the conversation, while Naima, giving nothing away with her expressionless eyes, was understood by those who knew her to be hiding a torrent of thoughts. Hava was only just beginning to get the gist of the exchange and was asking the ambassador seated next to her for further explanation. Kimizi looked back and forth nervously, not fully understanding the tension but not liking it, while Bathsheba, more experienced in such events, leaned slightly forward, watching the drama for any opening where she might be able to assist. Solomon replied to Tim Huncut, "Only by this policy, friend, can Israel prosper. Other nations may be able to prosper to a degree, with many gods, but Israel is not in such a position. Our God has chosen us, given us His covenant, and promised to bless us above what any other deity could if we would honor Him. This places upon Israel a responsibility that other nations do not have. If it seems to you an undue burden, I would suggest that you consider our present prosperity. Has any other God done as much for His people? Our God is honoring His covenant with us, as are we with Him. It is for love of Him that we serve Him. That He requires our complete consecration is but a small price to pay for the many benefits of His blessings." Tim Huncut snorted. "Consecration? Well, I'll give you this. At least your consecration has allowed your wives more discretion than some past Israelite kings did. For who among them would have allowed his queen to be presented in Babylonian attire?" And he raised his mug toward Hava, then took a good long drink, finishing the remainder without a breath. The eyes of the room came upon Hava. Solomon paled, caught in a rare moment of surprise, perceiving that something must have occurred outside of his awareness. It somehow concerned Hava, and perhaps was connected to that strange garland she wore. Hava blushed, then smiled at the group, not knowing if she had been complimented or insulted. Bathsheba lowered her face into her hands. All eyes turned back upon the king. Something must be said, and now. Hesitation in this moment is as perilous as the wrong word. "In Israel," Solomon said evenly, "we do not claim perfection in all of our goals, but simply require of ourselves that we continue to reach toward them. Nor do we demand perfection in any of our many friends, even you who are among us today. The grace we extend to ourselves, we also extend to you. So let us now go forth and prosper together," he called loudly, expertly adjusting his tone to change the atmosphere. The room let out a hearty cheer of agreement, happy to move past the tension of the moment. Tim Huncut seemed to relax. Hava smiled openly. Solomon was relieved, and Nathan sat expressionless. "Bring forth the music," Solomon called, clapping his hands twice, and a curtain was pulled back at the side of the room, where an ensemble that had been standing hurried to their seats and arranged their instruments. Hava, surprised, arose from her chair. There were supposed to have been acrobats and jugglers first, followed by an illusionist, whose every trick Solomon had already discerned in a private audition to ensure there was no real magic involved, and then Hava was to sing. But Solomon's intention now was to simply move the agenda along. His sudden call for music put her on stage immediately, where she would solo on some carefully chosen Jewish hymns. Solomon felt a brief moment of panic. Had he acted too quickly? Could Hava perform under the circumstances? There was something here not understood. For the first time, Nathan the prophet moved with definite purpose, signaling with his hand, and Solomon leaned over as the prophet whispered something in his ear. As the king listened, his expression changed almost imperceptibly, and he relaxed. Bathsheba noticed. Hava was taken to the stage. Solomon was aware of the redness on the back of her neck as she walked away from him toward the platform. Apparently, the insult in Tim Hunkut's last comment had finally dawned upon her. Solomon had not meant to embarrass her, but it could hardly be avoided under the circumstances. She would have to perform, the awkwardness of the moment notwithstanding. The music started. After a hesitant beginning, Hava's natural gifts as a performer took over, and soon she was given over to the music, taking her audience on a tour of musical heights like an expert guide, as she had done so many times before. She had them all smiling and laughing before long, and the entire group agreed that the Israelite queen would be a desirable addition to any court. "Too bad she's an Israelite," was a comment frequently heard. Following her performance, Hava was warmly greeted by all, at times a bit more warmly than Solomon was comfortable with, but to her credit, she had changed the atmosphere of the event, a skill at which she was uniquely adept. Solomon found himself thinking, as he often did, if only that gift could be channeled. Nathan slipped out as mysteriously as he had appeared, apparently having accomplished the one task for which he had come. Bathsheba excused herself early, pleading a headache. Naamah remained acceptably civil, and Kamizi seemed to enjoy a rare chance to spend some time away from her home of banishment outside the city. When the feast drew to a close, Solomon made the final speech, dismissing her guests with promises of a prosperous future friendship. The majority seemed receptive to his goodwill, welcome evidence that the evening's goals had been salvaged after a questionable beginning. After escorting the last of his guests to the gate, Solomon dismissed his guards and turned to slowly walk the stone path back to the palace alone. It was a clear spring night, and the sudden peace following an evening rich with noise felt delicious in his ears. As he approached the steps, he heard muffled voices and turned to notice two figures seated on a bench to the side of the stairs under a grove of large ornamental palms. Bathsheba and Nathan, the prophet, evidently, had not left the grounds after exiting the hall, but had remained here and were now engaged in a serious conversation. Solomon instinctively knew the subject under discussion. It was becoming harder to avoid every day. He changed his course to join them. Nathan and Bathsheba could see Solomon's face as he drew near, illuminated by the torchlights bordering the palace stairs, but to him, their faces were dark. They fell noticeably silent upon his approach. "It appears all that needs to be said has been said," he offered to their silence. Bathsheba glanced at Nathan and then back at Solomon. She had some inkling of her son's thoughts, but with the never-failing instinct of a mother, she had an even better read on his heart. He was quite torn up over the matter and did not need to be lectured. "There were some important successes this evening, my son," she said. "Congratulations." "Indeed," Solomon agreed and stepped forward to stand before them. "And some glaring failures, no doubt." "Sit down a moment." Solomon sat on a rock wall that bordered a decorative pool opposite them and rubbed the back of his neck, relaxing for the first time in several hours. "Have you spoken with Hava yet?" Bathsheba asked. "No." "Perhaps you would like me to speak to her," his mother offered. Solomon looked at her and hesitated. "If she will not hear me, how will she hear you? My whisper carries more weight in the kingdom than a shout to her. I'm just too common to her, I'm afraid." He ran his long fingers through his dark, wavy locks, staring at the ground. "But you are, of course, free to try," he added. Nathan peered at the king, lowering his head.
"Son, you well know that if talk could resolve this issue,
It would have been resolved long ago. This is not a matter of the ears, but of the heart. Solomon nodded. Nathan's words were true, but a lifetime of love and expectation was not easy to dismiss. I will speak to her again. Nathan and Bathsheba exchanged a glance. The night breeze fluttered the torches behind them momentarily. Bathsheba cleared her throat.
Son, I understand that you very much want to do what is right for the kingdom and also for Hava. We all love her, of course.
Of course, Solomon agreed, not sounding convinced. Nathan seemed to send Bathsheba a silent message. She turned to Solomon and asked an unexpected question.
Do you see my scarf here? The color of it, the style. Have you seen one like this before?
Solomon raised his gaze from the stones in front of him and looked at the lily gold silken scarf his mother was holding out toward him. Your scarf? Of course. It's like it's seen throughout all of Jerusalem. Nearly every maiden has one. Why?
They do now, she replied, but they didn't used to. This, in fact, is the first one. I purchased it from a merchant in Tyre when your father and I traveled there once years ago. I liked it, wore it often. It was not long before I began to see a similar style and color in the streets. I was queen. The daughters of Israel were watching me.
Solomon was nodding, knowing the direction her comment was going.
Son, you have been king now for 6 years. The young men of Israel look to you as a model. But the daughters of Israel, they do not know whom to follow. You have taken no Israelite queen. What are they to do? Should they continue to follow me? Or Naamah? Or Chemizi? Or one of who knows how many others? If they do not have a clear example, they will take what is before them, be it good or bad. The time is drawing near when you must take an Israelite queen.
And we all know in whom that example is most absent, you mean to say, Solomon finished for her. A queen of Israel represents the values of the kingdom, as does the king, Nathan explained, as I am sure you know. Solomon only nodded silently. He did know. He was just hoping that the Lord would visit Hava as he had visited him and had imparted to him a divine gift, wisdom. Honestly, before that encounter, Solomon knew he could not have had nearly the zeal for Jehovah that he did now. Hava was not an evil woman. She had just no such life-altering event. She was well taught, but she was lacking a personal experience with God. Solomon had been stalling and praying, but it was true. The situation could not be held in abeyance indefinitely. Already, evidence of Hava's influence could be noticed among the daughters of Jerusalem, if one had discernment to see, which Solomon did. Solomon looked over at Nathan, taking a thoughtful pose. Interesting, is it not, to have been taught the law from my youth, surrounded by it, immersed in it, like many lads in Israel, but still never understanding it until its author came and paid a personal visitation. He shook his head. One moment in that presence will teach you more than a lifetime of learning from books. Hava is the same as I, save this one indispensable difference. He looked directly at the prophet and paused thoughtfully. The two were nodding at him. How much longer do I have? Nathan regarded the young king with his kind old eyes. He loved him, even as he had loved his father, David, and discerned the turmoil in his heart. Jedediah, he replied, you are beloved of the Lord. So it has been spoken, and so it is. You have been divinely selected for your place as king. That ordination could not take place unless a fitting queen also existed in the mind of God, for the two make up a single thought. The queen that is needed to complete this kingdom will not be withheld from you. Only you must surrender to God's perfect will in the matter and be willing to sacrifice whatever must be sacrificed. I have no word from Jehovah for you. I have every reason to expect that God's ordained queen will be presented to you in this season, before the completion of the temple. And when you find her, there will remain no doubt in your heart.
Nathan's eyes projected the still confidence that was so familiar to those who knew him as he looked directly at, even through, it seemed, the young king.
Perhaps I have her already, Solomon said. Perhaps, the prophet agreed. But the fire must strike the altar, and it will. I take great comfort in that. I'm not unaware of these issues. How could I be? In fact, as of this night, I've made a decision. I will no longer allow this matter to take its own course. Nathan and Bathsheba looked at each other curiously, but Solomon offered no further explanation. If you will excuse me, I am tired. I appreciate your attendance at this important event, my father, he said to Nathan, and your wise counsel concerning all the matters of the kingdom. I am in very great need of your continued prayers on the issues that stand before me. Mother, he said softly, stepping forward. Bathsheba leaned toward him and received a kiss on the cheek. Know that I have heard you, and you serve me well, as always. He turned to leave, slowly mounting the steps to the palace, alone. Nathan and Bathsheba watched the elegant king as he left them. Then their eyes connected. Bathsheba shrugged, partially in hope, but also in wonder about what the king had in mind to do. Nathan nodded to her, but revealed nothing, neither in his eyes nor with his words. In his private chamber, Solomon changed into more comfortable clothing, but had no intention of retiring just yet. The incident with Hava represented the boldest break with protocol he had yet seen from her. It was not getting better. She was getting worse. Her behavior could not simply be ignored, as he had been perceived as doing thus far. He entered the palace yard again. His path this time took him off the stone walkway, through the grass, past the decorative pools, and into the orchard, after which he emerged in a clearing where the starry sky was visible. He took a few deep breaths, turned to look back, and then wandered back to sit on the edge of the pool. What can I do with such a maiden? He loved her. He had always loved her, but things were not the same now that he was king. He had responsibilities to the kingdom, to all of Israel, and to God. His eyes wandered over the scenery around him. He felt a pang of grief and wiped a few brief tears. She simply did not understand. That's all there was to it, and he could not make her understand. There was nothing to do but pray. If I do not see changes in her soon, I will be required to. He hesitated to even think it. I will have to replace her. I will have to find another queen. The wave of emotion swept back over him again. How could he do such a thing? What of the promise his father had made to her father, Kimham? But then again, the promise was not that Hava would be his queen, but his wife. He had always assumed she would be queen, but perhaps that had been presumption. After all these years, was Hava destined to be simply wife and not queen? Though he knew it would technically meet the requirements of his father's vow, it would mean the painful death of his childhood dream, and hers. He shook his head in inner resolve. He would not give her up without a fight. He would contend for her as long as possible. He was aware of the seriousness of the situation, even if she was not. It required extreme measures. Solomon had always advised against the making of vows, but under some circumstances, it was not only justified, it was necessary. This seemed to be just such a case. The decision came upon him suddenly, as though dropped from above. He would take the Nazirite vow. He knew the requirements. Under a Nazirite vow, a man would let his hair and beard grow untouched, not become defiled by contact with any dead body, and touch no fruit of the vine, be it wine, grapes, or even raisins, during the full term of the vow. At the end of the vow, his hair would be cut and presented to the Lord by the priest, the length of it signifying the time that had passed under the vow. The hair would be burned by the priest before the Lord, and various gifts and sacrifices would be offered. That was the process of the vow, but the particulars of the vow would be up to him. Solomon had never been desperate enough to take such a vow, though he had seen others do so. He was keenly aware of the seriousness of it, the offense it would mean were he to slip from it. But he was facing, for the first time, a situation desperate enough to warrant it. He wandered back out into the wooded area and knelt down before the Lord. A beautiful canopy of stars spread above him. He lifted his eyes to the heavens. Lord God of my fathers, your servant's life is in your hands. This great kingdom, which is the heritage of Jacob, is but loaned to me. Only by honoring you may your unworthy servant keep it. But if your ways are despised, let it be given to another, lest it become dishonored by my sins. Your wisdom, O God, has been my constant prayer, and your wisdom I now seek on this most important matter. It has been revealed to me that this kingdom must have a queen. The time is near when she must step forth. Yet your servant knows not, after all these years, who she is to be. My vow now goes forth before you, O God. If Hava is to be queen, arrest her heart as you did mine. If another is to be queen, reveal her identity to your servant. Please hear me, God, O God, and answer speedily. Your servant shall not cease from this vow until one of these two is accomplished. Solomon remained there a long while, the sweet Judean spring breeze playing with his hair and garments. The heavens remained painfully silent, while the wet grass soaked through his garments to cool his knees. Finally, he rose to return to the palace, slowly climbing back up the wide steps to meet the still silence of the sleeping palace. With emotions both hopeful and somber, he retired.